Ladies and gentlemen, run it back.
How you doing, brother?
Um, you know, it's interesting. I think I was more morbid. There's more morbidity last time. I think this time, I think I've just gotten used to the sort of necrosis of our political system. So I think just me personally, maybe it's just because I've been working out and maybe a little bit healthier than I was. I'm doing a little bit better on a personal vibe level, but in terms of intellectually, like I think things are pretty grim right now. But you know, we can look for silver linings a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of the moment. Yeah, I mean, we got all night. We're gonna be talking about everything that happened. So no need to front load it too much. But it's been interesting. It is. I think one thing that we're gonna have to sort of keep track of, Matt, over the next few days is to see how well it compares to 2016. Um, and my one hope would be that this is something that encourages a lot of people to get back involved with their local organizations like DSA. But plenty of time to get into all of that in a minute. We have a very special guest, somebody who Matt and I are huge fans of, who we've been actually meaning to get on the program for a very long time. Stephen Semler, who is the proprietor of the very excellent Polygraph on Substack. Stephen, how are you doing, friend?
I'm doing well. I'm relentlessly an optimist, not by nature, but I've forced myself to be this way through the power of positive thinking. So obviously, Trump victory isn't good news. However, let's think for a second if the Democratic Party was rewarded for the type of campaign that they ran, not just canceling the primaries, but effectively trying to push out progressives, the whole of the working class, Arab Americans in favor of neoconservatives, billionaires, and the national security establishment. So that's my coping mechanism, to be honest with you. It's like I haven't thought it entirely through, but that's what I've defaulted to so far.
It's funny you say that because on Sunday, I sort of said, I sort of opened myself to the notion people had that Harris might win big. And to me, that wasn't a necessarily good thing because of exactly what you're saying. If they could just throw such a middle finger to folks who cared about, name the issue, and then trot it along with Lynn Cheney, it would signal something in politics that I think would be nearly is not as big an obstacle as a MAGA continued 4 more years of MAGA in the White House. And it turns out that it was hubris ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like one of the things that is, I don't know, odd or strange about this moment is that in a lot of ways, this is a culmination of something that certain segments of the left have been talking about since 2020. I remember, the late great Mike Davis, had a really phenomenal piece, about the Trump movement, and a lot of people have done a lot of work trying to like understand exactly what the Trump movement is, what it represents. But starting in 2020, there's a lot of people on the left who started saying, "Hey, there's a problem here." And we're going to call that problem class de-alignment, which is there are signals that more and more members of the working class, more and more members of what we might call like the traditional Democratic voting bloc are leaning towards Republicans. And we've seen that really strongly here in Texas, particularly in this part of the state here. And I remember back in the day for Jacobin, right after the 2020 election, when everybody was, happy, obviously, that Trump's out and all this kind of stuff, I did a segment for Jacobin talking about the really worrying signs that we were seeing in South Texas, particularly with Tejano and Hispanic Texans moving towards the right, particularly pushing back against this like demographics is destiny theory that the Democratic Party had leaned into so hard. And I remember being drugged through the coals by a lot of leftists who like wanted to put their head in the sand about this very serious, problem that was going on with what the Biden coalition represented. right? Biden won, but there was warning signs there that Biden was cozying up to this more affluent class and was turning their back more and more on like this working class. And you saw similar things even in 2022, at least in Texas, where that was continuing, despite the fact that the Democrats, one had a great night during the midterm, that this is something that was in the cards. And last night was a culmination of a trend that's been going on for a really long time. But Stephen, you have a really great piece here on your Substack. And actually, before we get into it, why don't you tell people about what your work is, so people are more familiar with you and what you do over there?
So I, quote unquote, I was in the humanitarian sector. I worked for this major NGO based in Beirut called the Syria Humanitarian Access Team, or SHAT. They changed the acronym after I brought it up, unfortunately. So it's called like Crisis Analytics now or something. But ever since then, I've just been basically content creator. And over at Polygraph, I make a lot of graphs. It's kind of a shitty joke where the name comes from. But overall, I just try to think of, okay, what's the salient news topic? What information do people, what sort of information should people know about the situation? And it's basically just data driven. And the two most flattering ways that I've seen my charts used are, one, a high school teacher told me that they had used my charts in class, which is great because I'm corrupting the youth. But the second most flattering way, and the most popular way actually, is for people on Twitter to call each other dumbasses and basically fact check each other. So I take a great amount of pride in that. Yeah.
I mean,
you're a weapons manufacturer. Yeah.
we were talking with Stephen before the show, and I do feel like, I feel a little bit ashamed that you notice how much I retweet you, because, and specifically in those circumstances, basically as a cudgel against people who are saying, actually, the economy is good and stuff like that. But yeah.
But Stephen, I mean, I want to talk about a lot of other things here, but let's talk about this piece you put out yesterday called "A Couple of Charts to Explain a Harris Loss," and I have them handy here if you want me to bring them up. So just let me know and I can bring them up. But tell me about what these two charts were, what they represented, and why you think that they were so damning for the Harris campaign.
So the charts show just a massive increase in poverty and food insecurity since 2021. And I highlight 2021 through 2023, which is, these two big reports came out from the Census Bureau and the USDA in September. And I highlighted 21 through 23 just to show that there's been a lot of economic pain going on. And when I say economic, I'm not talking jobs reports. I'm not talking about the stock market. I'm talking about cost of living. I'm talking about personal finances. I'm talking about the livability of everyday life. So while there's been real pain going on, the Biden-Harris administration has effectively been gloating about jobs numbers, the stock market, GDP, which is, if it's not directly offensive to people, it just seems a little bit off base. And that's not the information that people want to hear. They want to hear more helpful information of how to deal with their situation. If not poverty, there's even more people, unable to afford household items in the last 7 days. And then even more people, 2/3 of people live paycheck to paycheck. So there's just been this vibe going on for probably the last 2.5 years, where we've seen an amazing national economic recovery. Like, it truly, like, they've earned some bragging rights because it's been super impressive. Every macroeconomic indicator I can think of ranges from pretty good to like historically good. But at the same time, the context doesn't really allow you to brag about it too much, because you have all this very real hardship going on the human security level. It's like this. It's like it conveys sort of a sense of arrogance, as if, like, akin to, like, if I walked into a library and thought to myself, all these women must be too shy to ask for my number. I guess I'll just start yelling it. It's just like, even if they were nominally interested in that information, hopefully one of them or more would be. They probably wouldn't be after I started just yelling my area code out in the middle of, whatever part of the Dewey Decimal System I was in. So that was basically the point of the piece. And as I said at the beginning of it, like, I made a whole bunch of charts in preparation for a Harris loss. And I never really looked at polls. I mean, I glanced at them here and there, but like the reason why I thought Harris would lose is because I saw for the last 120 has been voters' number one concern, not even close. Like over twice as much as abortion, and over twice as much as immigration, which are hugely salient topics. And I just saw the Trump people talking a lot about cost of living. Of course, no plan to improve it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the kind of arrogance, tone deafness coming from the Democratic Party just spelled bad news.
I mean, it was really bizarre, right? I mean, that the economic argument that we were getting from a lot of Harris like surrogates and people in the media was saying, yeah, everything is super great in the U.S. economy, and as you're saying, it's like, yeah, there are a lot of indicators that like you can make that argument to your friends in DC, maybe, but to folks who are really living it, it falls a little flat. And maybe to help us get into this a little bit, and I hope it's legible for folks. I'm sorry if not. There's a link below for everyone to read the piece in more in depth. I mean, could you talk us through this, Stephen? This first one here, poverty in the United States, and its increases and what that experience has been since 2021.
So there's basically three levels to financial hardship. The one is paycheck to paycheck living, where you have the bar that moves here and there, fluctuates, but it usually stays between like 55 and 60%. In September it was at 66% though. And then there's the group of, there's a subset of that group, like 40% of the population, who through the Household Pulse survey, the Census Bureau has been asking this question since early 2020. Have you had trouble affording basic household goods? And then poverty is the most serious level. And I understand there's like different levels of poverty, but those are basically the three levels of financial hardship. And all of them show pretty much this exact trend. It shows a sharp reduction in 2021 with the passage of the American Rescue Plan. And then in 2022, it shows not just an increase, but a historic increase. And you can look at child poverty too. It looks the exact same as this graph, basically, obviously different numbers. But, the tragedy is Democrats had the formula. They had the chance, like even with inflation, had they made permanent those temporary welfare positions in the American Rescue Plan, which is what they campaigned on. That's what Build Back Better was. The purpose of it was to make permanent, to capitalize on an emergency and make permanent a kind of diet European welfare state we had going on. Dope. But they reneged. And I think we can get into this later, but I think it was just a lack of political effort. And as a result, it doesn't really matter which human security variable you look at, they all get worse since 2021. And even if you break it,
this is damning.
Year.
Yeah, keep going. But this is extreme for people who are. Some people will be listening to. 2019, 38.3 million. 2020, 30 million. 2021, 25.6 million. And then we see a massive jump to 40.9 million. And by 2023, 42.8 million people living in poverty in the United States.
I'll just say, what are Democrats saying? Look at the unemployment numbers. We got your ass back to work, which like when Trump was saying that, when Trump says it about black people, people understand it as like a sort of patriarchal, like entitlement to labor or like labor coercion. And Democrats basically touted the unemployment the exact same way this entire time.
The haunting part is I'm working on a piece now, Matt. That's funny you bring it up because basically in early 2022, this was, basically a couple months out, or just like a few weeks after Biden gave up on Build Back Better, he was talking about deficit reduction. There's a huge pivot, like the whole narrative around his budget request for the next year in fiscal 2023 was about deficit reduction. None of the stuff was specific, none of the BBB stuff, the child tax credit, those sorts of things, the housing, the Medicaid, et cetera, was included in that specifically. So one of the reasons he gave for that, and like he started Biden basically started bragging about reducing the deficit around this time. And one of the ways that he mentioned him doing that is ending pandemic relief programs. And his very excuses, I'm finally getting to the point here. His excuse was, we've put Americans back to work. They don't need it anymore. But he campaigned on making those provisions permanent. So if coupled, with that huge that national economic recovery with jobs, et cetera, if they had enacted BBB, it would have, inflation still would have mattered, but people would have been able to deal with it. But instead, people had to deal with inflation as critical programs were expiring and being taken away. So that's why you see this specific pattern in the chart, like the jump from 21 to 22, and then again, the 22 to 23 just reflects an unwinding of a deterioration of that, as I said, that diet European welfare state we had.
Well, just really quick, Matt. I just want to bring up this other chart because it tells a similar story, and I just think let's bring them both in here because this is again Trump. We could talk about Trump and what he represents in a minute, but one thing he was talking about was like not just cost of living, but like specifically food, right? And like he talks about it like a weird guy and a rich guy and out of touch guy. But when you look at this, I mean, there's literally an experience of hunger that is dramatically increasing in this country in this period.
Right. Yeah. And, the reason, ultimately, the reason why I chose those two graphs isn't just because I had them ready and I've been kind of sitting on them, but they're the first two dimensions of the human security paradigm, which I don't know if it's like big in the humans. Yeah. So in 1994, there was this development report from the UN that sought to redefine what security meant. We had a lot of this discussion in 2022, where it's like we had this huge military budget, but we were radically unprepared for a pandemic. So it's like, okay, so what does security actually mean? Are we thinking about it in terms of, we're obsessed with national security, this concept of the state, but we should be focusing on security at the human level primarily. Now, I embrace that view. I take a little bit more nuance. So like my working theory and what I try to do is I think policies should be designed foremost to improve the security of the working class. Because you bypass the national security bullshit, that stuff still matters, but you automatically you predispose international solidarity. And besides, workers make the economy go, so we should think about them first. So, and again, you brought up Mike Davis earlier, like the earth belongs to labor. Like, I'm pretty sure that was a quote, and like I fully subscribe to that. But anyway, I mean, the first two dimensions of this human security paradigm are economic security and food security. And economic security does include employment opportunities, so that's part of the equation. And Biden definitely recovered it because employment's at very low, like 3 or 4% or whatever. But at the same time, it also includes access to a social welfare net. And it also includes the ability to afford the necessary household items. And, food insecurity, same deal. Yeah.
I'm just going to read these out, Stephen. No, keep going. Yeah. I just want to read these out for the listeners. So this chart is that U.S. food insecurity increased 40% since 2021. In 2019, 35.2 million people are experiencing food insecurity. 2020, it jumps up to 38.3 million. In 2021, it drops. And this is, I think, a really important part about these charts too, Stephen, right? Is that people not only is the increase, but the fact that people also experience the drop, right? Which means, people experiencing this as a recent experience in their life. That goes up in 2022. Sorry, I know this is tough with a lot of numbers for listeners, but in 2022, it goes from 33.8 million in 2021 to 44.2 million in 2022. And by 2023, 47.4 million people in the United States of America experiencing food insecurity.
I mean, a simple way to say it is also the child poverty rate doubled after those programs elapsed. And it's wild to me. Like, we had this, I have a huge thread where I have like a few quote tweets of Stephen in there, but my tweet was like 2 years ago, which is like, if you're saying the economy's good, compared to the G7 or whatever, which, like, as you say, Steve, we're not blind to those metrics, but you have to look at like what this means for like rent prices or these sorts of things. And it's like, it's been absolutely dire, and it was before COVID. So returning to some sort of pre-COVID normal, and also like the pattern on the back for the wage increases, everything's inflated. So like, if wages would have been the one thing that weren't inflated, I think that would have been even more of a shock. But right. Yeah, sorry, I kind of, ranted.
No, and one of the things is like, if you do your own shopping, which I'm pretty sure all of us do.
Yeah.
Like, you go to the grocery store, it feels like, I mean, every time you go to the grocery store, it kicks you in the head and takes your wallet. That's at least how I feel. So I did make a chart of this like a couple months ago. It was after Biden's debate performance, and like Jake Tapper's first question to him, this was like the catastrophe debate, where it was just a total abomination. But it was odd though. Like, Biden was horrible the whole night, but he was at least somewhat able to talk about NATO, which is truly like his breadbasket and what he cares about. But the very first question Jake Tapper asked about food prices, but I think that was the one where Biden ended it with saying, "We finally beat Medicare." It was just like non-existent. And meanwhile,
and then Trump's like, "Yeah, you beat it to death."
yeah. Trump was feeling so smug with himself because he's finally doing well in debate. But food prices have increased. Household food costs have increased 35% since 2020, which is just massive. Food insecurity is at its highest level since 2014. These are all charts that I've made or in the past or have maybe haven't published. But you just see a decline in these everyday metrics where it's tangible and it's painful. It's like if the GDP loses 100 billion tomorrow, it's like we don't feel that. That's just something that happened. Like, fluctuations in GDP are just something that goes on when you're at the pub or on a podcast or reading a book. You don't necessarily feel it, but you do feel it like tangibly.
Well, this is why, I mean, one of the arguments that we were getting from pundits and writers and even from the campaign to a certain extent was like, oh, well, Biden is like Biden and then Kamala sort of suffering from like the bad vibes economy, right? And like the idea was that like this is just like, oh, people have bad vibes about it and like and whatever. And it's like, these graphs, and these aren't the only ones out there, right? That sort of are showing this experience of struggling that a lot of Americans are having. That's not a vibe. Right. That is literally like, I'm worried about being able to put food on the table for my family.
Yeah, this is how you measure, those human security variables I mentioned. That's how you measure, human conditions in disaster zones. So on one hand, I've done a lot of work on the humanitarian response to Gaza, and I've done a lot of work on Gaza. Recently, there's this big report from Brown University on the total cost of U.S. military aid and military support for Israel. I co-authored that report with Linda Bilmes, who's brilliant from Harvard, and then Bill Hartung, who does great work as well at Quincy Institute. But I bring that up, one, to gain credibility with the audience, so they just don't think I'm an idiot, but because I've already talked about yelling my number in the library. But I bring it up because I'm looking at human security variables in Gaza, and I'm looking at it in the U.S., and I'm seeing just both. I'm seeing deliberate starvation in Gaza, and I'm seeing increasing food insecurity for no fucking reason in the U.S., where there's no, Israel isn't killing, grocers and bombing people on their way to the grocery store. So it was just an unambitious domestic policy put forth by Harris that didn't address any of this stuff, along with, a pro-genocide foreign policy that just zapped the movement from all the energy. Like in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of Harris people around, credit to them for door knocking, but they had the energy of people asking you to get a flu shot. Like the energy just wasn't there. So.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can pull that on. I'd actually like to expand and talk about that a little bit more in depth in a moment, but just on these charts and this argument about like that this wasn't a fucking vibe. This was like an actual experience. I mean, it really drives me crazy. I mean, one thing, for people who've been listening to Left Reckoning for years, that we really go ahead, Matt.
Child poverty doubled. That's not vibes. And the only people that could convince themselves of vibes as people that have no connection, like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon connection from people that experience actual poverty. Yeah. And that's the entire media. Like none of them experience poverty. It's why, like it is.
But what's exhausting about it, Matt, is like, one, they don't get it, right? But what makes me really angry about it is this fucking canard that gets trotted out every year. Is like, quote unquote, like people voting against their interests or not knowing their interests. Like, I'm not saying that the right is like offering a solution to any of this kind of thing, but to act here like when somebody says, "Oh, I'm mad about the Biden economy," right? That they're not like acting in their interest of saying "fuck you" to those people is just wrong. You're missing the fact that this very real thing. And I want to ask you, Stephen, like on this point, right, on this vibes economy thing, one of the narratives that I think is going to become the narrative, right? From smart people we might like and respect, is that inflation is a killer in politics, and the Biden administration just got a hard hand, right? Because a lot of governments struggled in the elections with the inflation. Could you speak a little bit about how maybe the Biden administration could have avoided this? I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but like, what is it like materially that they could have done? It wasn't just like, oh, God gave them a bad fucking hand. They made massive mistakes here that increased these problems that we're talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, taking like greedflation took way too long to catch on as a serious concept.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's like, I understand stuff happens in the supply chain. It was a global pandemic. Of course, things are happening in the supply chain, but it's pretty easy to tell when price gouging is going on. And Harris came out with that proposal. Like that was part of like an anti-price gouging provision in her economic proposal, but it was 4 years too late. And it wouldn't address anything now. But anyway, the government basically had two approaches to inflation relief. For the people, it decided that its primary response was going to be reducing the deficit, aka austerity.
Yeah.
And of course, Biden cut spending, but it didn't improve inflation.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't. So he was automatically approved wrong with that. But the other approach to inflation was with respect to the Pentagon. So Trump increased the military budget massively during his time in office. I think 20% in real terms from Obama's last budget to Trump's final budget. I think Biden's over 30% now. I know the budget for this past year was $953 billion, which is more than the U.S. spent on its military in 1943. So that gives you a clue into two very different approaches to inflation. So for the people, austerity, but for the Pentagon, the price has gone up on the stuff you buy. Oh, here's more money. Even though the Pentagon sort of it sets all the prices. It's a state-run, centralized economy. It's kind of cool in that respect, especially with the healthcare provision. So a lot of leftist veterans I know always talk about like.
I mean, what's it, Friedrich James?
The VA.
Yeah, Friedrich James. We were talking about this recently. Friedrich Jameson was like, expand the military. Anyway, we could get lost on that one, but
yeah. I'm already getting sidetracked anyway. But yeah, but essentially going after price gouging. I don't know exactly how that would work in terms of the corporate thing, but
I'm sorry. Their plans on the grocery stuff was pretty half baked. I'm sorry. Like,
okay, yeah.
It was nice that like they were thinking about maybe addressing it to a certain extent. But it was it wasn't as material, and the voters rejected it. So
they said it once and ran away from it, and it seemed like the kind of thing. It's like, okay, this is what we give AOC to like get the endorsement or something like.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't Matt Brunack who said if they're worried about that, then they should just buy the grocery stores.
Yeah, and I think like I should have mentioned this before, but when the Biden administration made deficit reduction its primary inflation response, he reduced the deficit by not enacting BBB. So he spun his failure, if you want to call it that, or reluctance to get BBB passed as sort of a victory for deficit reduction, which is kind of the shit. I mean, before the genocide, obviously, probably the shittiest thing he's done as president.
Because again, that included child poverty programs for one instance.
Yeah, the expanded child tax credit. And then it also included these things called child care stabilization grants, which I wrote about independently. But like they kept child care centers open during the pandemic, and child care is already expensive because it's not funded through broad-based taxes. It's like going to like a private college. Basically, I got to pay tuition. I don't know any of this stuff because I don't have kids, but I learned a ton about it while writing about it. And that's a provision that expired in 2023, along with the restarting of the student loans. And you saw another uptick with along with inflation being still relevant. You saw a major uptick as a result in financial hardship. But as a result of the expiration of that, plus the child tax credit. I mean, but so basically, if you have a child about the size of a fire hydrant, you're either paying more for childcare or you're earning less because you're taking time off work to take care of your kid because childcare is too expensive. So it really just put people in a bind. And again, the fact that like if inflation's going to happen, then you do everything you can to make it more livable.
Mm.
That's what they did for the Pentagon, but they didn't do it for the people.
Well, you
And
know,
it's like that's you don't have to invent policy. Like you chain it to like certain measures for like social security or whatever. Like right, like we've done this and like the expanded Build Back Better failure. I think you're right. Like that moment was such a signal of um, we're done here. We're actually done.
well, I
We've
mean,
done enough.
Stephen, I mean, to broaden it out a little bit, and Matt and I are going to do a little bit of a post mortem on the election later in the episode. But I want to ask you this, Stephen. I mean, um, what is the motivation here from your chair? Is it the Biden administration is bad at politics? They don't like winning, or do you think that they were serving different masters? Did they have a different goal for government than staying in power and keeping the right out? I mean, I know it's a difficult question to answer, but for us, I'll just say for us, for people who've been watching Left Reckoning for the past 4 years, I remember, Matt. Remember when we were talking about this? We were losing our minds because the first days of the Biden administration are Joe Biden is the reluctant FDR, and he's basically going to take us out of this pandemic and this crisis and like reinvigorate, some form of American social democracy or at least FDR liberalism, right? Which is always a fantastical, take. But it was crazy to me to watch it get worse and worse and worse. And I struggle with the answers. Like, are they just bad at politics, or were they more interested in serving, different sections of American society, mainly the wealthy classes here?
I'm going to go with the last thing you said. Look, if you compare the 2020 Democratic platform to the 2024 Democratic Party platform, and listen, only perverts read the whole thing through and through. So anyway, I'm reading the whole thing through and through, and the difference really is quite shocking. Like, we were all dissatisfied in 2020 because it just didn't go far enough given the circumstances, and we were right. But compared to the 2024 version, like, my God, put the hawkishness stuff aside. But a public option isn't even included in it. I mean, they're talking about $1 trillion green infrastructure program, massively expanded social welfare program. So in between those 2 points, I like a couple months ago, I guess I tried to figure out what happened, because there's clearly an ideological shift, and why that ideological shift happened, I think, relates to your point is that, I think they just serve different masters. But so I think the long story short is, once people put the end of Build Back Better in the campaign, they pinned it on Manchin, but Manchin came out against it in December. But Biden kept talking about it until late February, or pretty much like late into February. What changed is Russia invaded Ukraine. And I'm not, look, sovereignty underlies the international system. I'm not blaming Ukraine at all for this, but I'm not blaming Russia either. I think at that moment, Biden decided, you know what, fuck this domestic stuff. I'm way more interested in foreign policy. And I think at that moment, he decided it was right for a rebrand, and he rebranded as a deficit hawk. The discursive shift is so unbelievably shocking. I mean, from February, he never talked about cutting spending up until March 2022. And then it was all he talked about pretty much. So if you compare, if you line up, I mean, February 2022 and March 2022, and just plot out how many times he mentioned Build Back Better and deficit reduction, it's like a wall. It's just like dots, like there's never the twain shall meet. It was just a really shocking turnabout. And I think that's part ideological, but I mean, there's also, as you mentioned, there's like systems in place where, the Democrats would rather court billionaires and, push progressives out, which was proven true during the Harris campaign. So that's kind of a shitty explanation, but
no, I mean, I think you're right though. Like, in Biden in his like catatonic state, right? He suddenly gets awoken during that disaster of a debate. And he, as you noted before, just starts talking about NATO. I mean, this is somebody realizing, oh, this is like my thing now. This is what I care about.
I think, 100%. I think there's a sense of sleeping at the wheel through 4 years. And I think, they shifted personnel a little bit. And probably the one guy that was like, shit, we're getting through some, like a little bit of like industrial policy through here. He probably is like edged out by the guys who are like, actually, it's wartime. Sorry, we're done with that.
Yeah, and there's a shift in even like if you look at like on a narrow level too, like originally Biden's climate investments, tax credits were an afterthought to it. It was direct state investment. It was like the Pentagon buying weapons. It was like state creates demand on its own, instructs, holds a bid, and private companies build. It was direct state investment, which is, I'm all for that. Like what the climate crisis needs, the military industrial complex has. Even just 1 year of a military budget for the climate, dope. It would be so cool. I mean, keep in mind, like, think about this. The amount of money in Biden's infrastructure plan in total is $548 billion. The amount of money that went to private arms contractors from this year's Pentagon budget, I estimate at over $550 billion in 1 year. So it's just, and think about what you could do with climate. You could decarbonize the entire transportation system, or at least make a good dent.
And even when it comes to the infrastructure bill, I mean, this is something we talked about a lot with Matt Huber, right? It was like so much of it was, putting control and incentives into the market, right? To have like the private sector, deliver, instead of, building up state capacity to deal with this crisis, right? So like you could talk about the budget numbers, but it's fundamentally even different for the military, because at least with the military, like they have contractors, but like there's a military. You know what I mean? There's a structure there. There's something that the government runs. Here, they're like, oh, here, tax credit here, incentive there. So let's try to grease the wheels of the market to try to get it to solve this fundamental crisis.
Yeah, and I watched that episode with Matt Huber with you guys, and I remember very clearly a quote. He said, fighting the climate crisis through the tax code." That quote has stuck with me ever since. It's just permanently edged in my brain. It's true. That's the point I was trying to make. It's like people hold up the IRA, but it's like the effects of it, like, sure, like, yeah, enhances green investment. That's great, but it just not directly translatable in the capitalist system is just too slow to respond to the climate crisis. That's the whole reason why people like me argue that it should be considered, a security issue, to elevate it above normal politics. That's the whole point of securitizing the climate crisis. But anyway, I mean, I forgot what point we were going on.
No. That's all. I mean, Stephen, really appreciate you joining us and talking about your work. I wanted to throw to you, and this is an open question just before we let you go, because Matt and I are going to give our post-mortem and talk about, all the other lessons here. But is there anything else that you sort of feel like you'd like to our listeners to take from last night, on top of everything else that you mentioned? Not to throw you on the spot too. You talked for 40 minutes, so no worries.
No, I talked a lot. I actually was more curious to hear you guys' take, but I so much rattling around in my brain. I think the one thing is, again, this goes back to the coping mechanism I mentioned at the beginning. Like, you think about climate. If Harris won, we wouldn't get major progress, or if any climate progress. And then Harris would lose in 2028. And then, so it would be 8 years, perhaps even 12, before we got another real shot to have a legitimate climate bill. Under Trump, it's going to be major unwindings, and it's going to be bad. But at the same time, I think his presidency will be a shit show. And I think we'll have another opportunity in 2028 to make inroads. So again, this is just a coping mechanism. I haven't thought this entirely through, but I'm just trying my best to consider the opportunities here. And again, like, if the Democratic Party was rewarded with their strategy and they won, I wouldn't have known what to do, really, because it would mean the complete abandonment of the working class. It would mean they had won being overtly hostile to the peace movement. So that in some ways I was actually more scared of a Kamala victory, but just going to be bad. But we got each other, and I think you're right. We have to figure out how to take advantage, to fight. Like, it's like anything, man. Sucks. You got to buck up, get back in the saddle. Stephen, real pleasure speaking with you. You're welcome back on the program anytime. Could you tell folks how to follow you and keep up with your work? Yeah, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Substack at Stephen Semler. My Substack's called Polygraph. And make sure you support this show too, because you guys do fantastic work. So
also, Steven's on Blue Sky, which I got to shout out the Blue Sky folks. I didn't realize I had got a 1.2 thousand followers on Blue Sky. I haven't logged in weeks.
I think I have 1.200.
You have 336, but I think it's gonna go up. We're gonna get to 500 folks. If you're listening, we don't have that many people listening. Maybe Blue Sky. If I'm just meaning like, are they all on Blue Sky though? But if you are on Blue Sky, folks, it's going to be popping over there. I think from 2.0.
Might be. Yeah, but seriously, Stephen, real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, definitely all mine. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, brother. Steven. Yeah, I mean, this bit, these the people should definitely read the article. There's a link below to read it, and like. I mean, Matt, it's time for it's time for us to do the D to do our rank punditry. But I will say that like this bit from Stephen, I think is really, really important to sort of reckon with. That like all this people were being gaslit and being lied to about the experience of living in this country. And, sometimes you have to just look at those raw numbers and say like, yeah, you know what? It's not just a feeling, it's an actual experience. And you know what? People should be given a lot more credit than they're given by even a lot of leftists sometimes for like how they're experiencing and working through things.
That Will Stansel guy becoming the icon of the vibe session sort of thing. And how heinous it is because that whole, the child tax credit, child poverty reduction issue, the whole thinking that I remember like is, once this is in place, it's going to be very hard to retract. And that's been sort of like a sort of truism for a while now. They used to say it about Roe versus Wade actually too. And the truth is, when you got a media like ours, and then parties that are geared towards people who child poverty is only an issue to the extent that you're not able to get people to fucking work during a pandemic. Like, let's be real. That's why that reduction was instituted. And it was like a massive reduction in child poverty before that because of that policy of the child tax credit. And we just decided that's too expensive. That's too expensive.
And then just rubber stamping money to fucking Israel to murder kids in Gaza. I mean, really, shows where the priorities are. War on kids all across the globe, frankly.
Yeah. And look, like I don't think I'm not satisfied to think along the lines of they deserve to lose, so they did. But that's a deserve to lose action there. And they lost.
Well, they lost, and they lost big. And I think that one of the messages that I want to make clear to the audience, and at least how I'm thinking about it, and I think you probably agree with me, Matt, is that they lost this election. They lost it. Trump didn't win it. The Democrats lost this election. And there's a lot of conversations that we're going to have tonight and in the future about it. But maybe to get us started, we should take some. Matt and I, basically when it comes to it, we're kind of like semi-pro, right? We're semi-pro pundits, Matt, compared to like the big folks on MSNBC. Let's look at the brilliant analysis from MSNBC last night about what happened in the Kamala Harris campaign.
And I think it's important to say that, anyone who has experienced or been in the United States for any period of time and experienced this country's history and knows it cannot have believed that it would be easy to elect a woman president, let alone a woman of color. Let's just be clear. And nothing that was true yesterday about how flawlessly this campaign was run is not true now. I mean, this really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. Queen Latifah never endorses anyone. She came out and endorsed. She had every prominent celebrity voice. She had the Taylor Swift, she had the Swifties, she had the Beehive. Like, you could not have run a better campaign in that short period of time. And I think that's still true.
Matt hasn't seen this, y'all. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a shame because I thought we were winning Joy. Read over. She said, case study QB, one of the better Clippers, who's not like a
big fan of case study QB.
Who's not like Aaron Rupar, right? Language is not enough. This needs to end, she said on August 13th, 2024. I guess when did that must have been after Kamala was in.
Well,
When did
that must
Kamala
have been
join?
after the Queen, before the Queen Latifah
Well, I
endorsement.
mean, that shit's crazy. I mean, first of all, I would say, like, hey, Taylor Swift, next time you endorse, can you fucking wait when we're not on like a heater and it's gonna get swallowed up by like me crushing Donald Trump in a debate? Because that's when Taylor Swift deployed her thing. The second point I'd say is it probably doesn't mean that much anyway. Like, how many times do we need to see this? Beyonce toured with Hillary. Like this
Yeah, it's
is
crazy.
this is like probably the same. It's like getting the band back together, for Christ's sake.
I mean, it's frankly,
Biden
it's
stepped down in
it's
July.
it's
So
that.
she said that about Kamala's campaign. Like, so this needs to change, but whatever. Just blame it all on Joe, I guess.
Matt, I'm gonna get a little. That is such a contempt. That is saying something like that. Is such a statement of contempt for the American people, for American democracy, to say, "Hey, all of your favorite people from television told you to do this thing, and you didn't. That's a flawless campaign." Are you fucking kidding me? Are you kidding me? I mean, that is just a complete um, abstraction from reality, from the actual experience, and the reason that people show up and vote and engage in politics is that they're just going into, oh, I want to be on team Beyonce. I want to be on team Taylor Swift. It's absurd to sit here and talk about politics at this level. And it shows the vapidness and the weakness of certainly the media, but they're fucking low hanging fruit at this point, right? It shows the weakness of the strategists who are feeding that kind of fucking argument and those kind of ideas to somebody like Joy Reid, right? Because that's how it works, right? There's people in the campaign, and this is how they say, our strategy is this. And to sit here and say, like, oh, look, we got all the celebrity endorsements. This was a repudiation. This election was a repudiation of the Democratic Party, of this kind of quote unquote elite consensus. It hurts you to get all of the fucking people on television telling you to do something. It is the opposite effect of what somebody like Joy Reid is sit here implying, that it's something that gets people out to the polls. Now, add in all the other factors, the Gaza and genocide, the increase in poverty for American folks, the fact that most people think that their life is worse than their parents, right? Add all that in, and it just shows the complete contempt that these people who are given the opportunity to speak to millions have for the average American. And it's no doubt that the people reject you when this is what your perspective of them is.
And I hear in the chat, like, heard the thing about all the voter registrations too. You don't know how many people are registering because it's like, fuck Taylor Swift. Like, I just, like, proof is in the lack of pudding. You can't run based on everyone's favorite celebrities. Like, it's so artificial. Like, I mean, by nature, like, I mean,
And this is what the demand. This is effectively. All right, let's talk a little nuts and bolts here. This is effectively what the Kamala Harris campaign was. They wanted to return to the kind of simulacrum of American politics, right? There's a team blue and a team red, and is the economy doing whatever, blah blah blah, and this is going to mean that this team wins or this team loses, right? They want to return to the old way of doing politics in this country. When election after election, we are getting one very fucking clear message. If it's people supporting Bernie Sanders, or God forbid, people supporting Donald Trump, it's people saying, we don't want this fucking machine to continue anymore, right? We want this machine to break down. And you have a Democratic Party that's saying, what if we could just return to the old ways, to the old way of doing politics? And the Kamala Harris campaign, we talked about this on Sunday, and so if it's for patrons only, so some people didn't hear it. But I remember I asked you what was like the argument, and it's not an easy question to answer what the Kamala Harris argument was, right? Because they ran a campaign that was very much focused not on winning a majority or winning an election, but winning a certain kind of voter. They wanted to win the affluent, the ascendant classes, and they also wanted to coalesce around like centrist Republicans, right? This kind of fantasy politics that they have. But I want to be really clear actually about this, is that it's not that they have a bad calculation and they just think that there's more of those voters than there are. It's that that's the coalition that they want to represent in government. Right. That's who they want to be the leader of. Because when you have a working class coalition, then people start saying like, hey, childhood poverty is increasing, or hey, it's getting more and more difficult for me to feed my family. What is your policy on that? Now, if it's just, oh, we're going to return to civility in office. I know we had a lot of work today, Matt, and you might not have caught it, but the fucking Kamala Harris concession speech was emblematic of it. The proudest and the biggest line of applause in her speech was her saying, we're going to concede the election and restore American democracy, right? In a lot of ways, that's like their goal. In a lot of ways, like mission accomplished. They lost the election, they accepted the results, and they gave it to this bloated billionaire who is going to wreak havoc on the American people and fuck the globe on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention what's going on geopolitically that I've seen. I mean, continued just massacres in Israel, whether it's accelerating or not.
Yeah, and
it sucks.
And this is all right. So, I mean, let's talk Gaza for a second, and then I want to talk about like the actual voting shifts. The Gaza stuff, I mean, it's horrific. It's continuing. I mean, just the day of the election or the day before the election, we got more news. 20 people just shot, killed, just brutally murdered by the state of Israel, state that that Biden supports, that Kamala Harris supports, and yes, Trump supports as well, right? And you look at all the polling and all the information. This was a turnout killer. And on top of it being a turnout killer, it was something that was demoralizing people. This is why you had all of this hand wringing about whether or not people should vote or not vote for Kamala Harris, because people were like, oh, I'm worried about Trump. I'm worried about all this kind of stuff. But man, thinking that I'm voting for this horrific act to continue is something that I don't know if I can stomach. Right. And you're just seeing it across the board. Thank you. Sorry if I misspoke.
I think that was me.
Okay. The people are saying, I don't want this to continue anymore. And it hurts your ability to engage canvassers, to have people engage in your, because how can you go to a fucking rally for Kamala Harris
the decent people
in Pennsylvania and walk past protesters who are saying, why are you doing this to children? How do you not think that's going to fucking depress turnout? And why are you doing it? Was it something that's popular with Democratic Party voters? No. We saw time and time again that the number one thing that the Kamala Harris campaign could do to shore up the election and to garner more support was to come out and say, we're done with the Joe Biden killing policy, with the burn them all policy of the Democratic Party. And they refused. And now we can figure out why, right? But that was fundamentally a mistake that, one, drove down turnout, but it also made it difficult for people to support this campaign, even for people who made the devil's bargain to do it with any kind of enthusiasm. I mean, as Stephen was saying, every time he saw anybody working around the campaign, it was low energy, and understandably and rightfully so, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard is there's a brief moment after we got fucking Biden off that people thought, oh shit, let's do it. And they immediately snuffed it out and put out all the embers and doused water on it by sending Richie Torres and Bill Clinton to Michigan.
And Richie Torres, who the fuck is that? I bet you there's people listening to this don't even know who he is, other than maybe as like the villain, right? This is not a popular member of Congress. This is somebody who is known for one thing and one thing only, for being an ardent cheerleader for the massacre of children in Gaza.
From one of the poorest districts in the country.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not enough, right? Add to it this rejection of building everything we were talking about. I remember we were talking about that when Kamala Harris first, got the nomination. There was all these whispers. If you read publications like the Financial Times, all these whispers that she was sort of saying, "Hey, let's reset with the capitalist class, with the tech industry, and with bosses in this country." They had Sean Fain, right? An incredible speaker, an incredible figure, coming out in support of them. And was he even a mainstay on the campaign? Was he even somebody who they were sort of highlighting? No. And that was a message that was damn clear, I think, to everybody out there about how serious Kamala Harris was considering continuing the limited and weak low bar policies of Joe Biden when it comes to labor. And yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I mean, there's a couple statements that I've seen have been to this point. I know we want to get to the Bernie one here, but this one is from the Painters Union General President Jimmy Williams Jr. here. Let me just put this up for folks. My full screen.
I'll make it, yeah.
Working people deserve a party that understands what's at stake and that puts their issue. I mean, banger opening sentence, because that is the fundamental problem. Mm-hmm. Working people deserve a party that understands what's at stake and that puts their issues front and center when campaigning and governing. A potential Republican trifecta, along with Project 2025, will be catastrophic for unions, including my own. But if the Democrats want to win, they need to get serious about being a party by and for the working class.
You know, and just on that, Matt, really quick, you know, this is something that I think is kind of fundamental here, is that agree or disagree, right? No one in the fucking pundit and centrist class can say that American labor did not show up for these folks. Mm-hmm. They did it, and I know for a fact it was extremely difficult and painful for them to do so, because agree with them or disagree.
Costly.
What? And costly.
And costly.
Yes. Agree with them or disagree with them. They said the Trump administration represents such a distinct and visceral threat to the future of American labor that we will, we will operate with these folks. And that's why you're going to hear people say, oh, turncoats, right? Oh, they're not loyal. Why are they? They're saying it now because they take the argument that left liberals and progressives make all the time, which is like, hey, you got to support the lesser of two evils, right? And I don't at this point, I don't even want to relitigate it, right? But the point is that labor, a lot of labor, right? Not all, but a lot of labor said, yeah, that's true. We'll come out and support y'all. And they got fucking nothing for it, right? And now they're getting attacked by figures. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that they showed up for them when that party wouldn't show up for working people. And, costly, both like literally in the sense of like costing them money supporting these candidates, and too costly in the sense of like reputation, saying something, you know, coming out for these people who everybody knows isn't going to be out there to support the working class.
Yep, exactly.
And before we get to the Bernie, unless that is that where you're going?
That's where I was going.
Before we get to the Bernie, I want to ask you, because it's baked in there. Do you are you comfortable calling it a realignment yet?
No, because I think we're in a very weird period, and I don't know what the Republicans look like post-Trump. But I do think that Democrats have done everything they can to lose lower income people, and they've been doing it for so long, for so goddamn long. And I mean, that's the thing, is like it's hard to judge based on Trump, but if like JD Vance wins big in 2028 or something like that, that would be a signal that yes, we've realigned, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point, Matt, about seeing if this is, there's no doubt about it. There was an abandonment. The working class, as we'll get to with Bernie in a minute, said no to Kamala Harris. And that's undeniable. I think that the Democrats in this country, and I'm saying this as a Texan, somebody who's seen this when I was a kid, right? They're coming. When I was a kid here, you know, the Democrats were running the state, and then they lose. And the Democrats haven't won statewide office in Texas. And I know it's one of those things where for some people in the audience, you're just like, oh, well, Texas was always right wing. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. This was a deliberate program of the right to win this state. And now they have it to such a point that, like, the idea, when I tell people about somebody like Ann Richards, again, who was governor when I was, too, like, they're like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing, right? What the Democrats did when they saw this loss was they burrowed down and they started telling themselves this beautiful story, this beautiful tale, that one day the white people are no longer going to be the majority in the state of Texas, and then they are going to be able to run away with elections. And that tale is called Demographics is Destiny. And it was this idea that once Texas becomes a non-majority, a state that's not majority Anglo and non-majority white, that they're going to be able to dominate state politics, right? Well, that's happened. Texas is not a majority white state. And what has happened every election cycle, since 2016 to today, is that minorities, particularly Hispanic voters, are moving more and more over to the Republican Party. What happened here? I'm sorry to be a little cornacky over here, but like what happened here in South Texas just last night was a washout. This is what was called the blue wall of Texas, right? It was always blue. So Texas would usually go red, and there was this area that was always competitive for the Democrats, and that was where they were hoping to build out of to be able to maybe win a Senate race, a governor's race, all this kind of stuff. Well, that has evaporated, and it's trickled for a while, but it's been something that's been abundantly clear that those voters are rejecting the Democratic Party. And instead of I'm using Texas as a warning tale. I'm going to talk more about this in depth in a future episode. But instead of investing in changing the politics of the Democratic Party, getting more serious about becoming a grassroots party, hell, talking about poverty in a state that produces so much wealth for this country and is the energy capital of the world, right? They doubled down on elite interests, an interest of the suburbanites and the upper middle class. And guess what? Those poor working class Hispanics who they thought were just going to be a part of the coalition forever said no, right? And I use this as an example because I think this is like the fundamental strategy of the National Democratic Party, right? Has been that they're just going to, as America, like Texas, demographic shift, that they were just going to be able to shore up majorities in every election going forward. And what we've seen now with Trump, and particularly in this last election, but there's been signals of it for a while now, is that was a fantasy, and not showing up for people hurts. It hurts you fundamentally because people lose their trust in you. So we're going to hear pundits. We've already been hearing some folks saying like, well, Kamala Harris actually did run an economy focused campaign. Insane, a lie. But I said this last night when we were watching the results come in, Matt. And if you want to talk about how difficult it is, people didn't want the fucking cliche ad where it's like, oh, I would like things to be cheaper. They wanted you to say, here's why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And people in this country are smarter than a lot of fucking pundits give them credit. And I'll expand it. A lot of people on the left give them credit too. That when you start talking about how difficult it is to get by and an opportunity economy and all this bullshit, and you don't talk about the people who are making this economy unfair, the people who are taking value from you, people know you're full of shit. And that was exactly what we saw last night.
Yeah, I want to save this Obama speech for the post game, but I do want to, Uncle Bernie is back, and we've had our
We just preview it a little bit. Preview this Obama thing for the post game for folks before we get to the Bernie.
April 2009, Obama's been president for about 12 weeks, and he outlines his economic recovery plans from criticism from the left and the right. Would you have it? And I think that there's certain things regarding, Israel policy in the near term that I would say like didn't help Harris, but this general class issue we're dealing with here and the ascendancy of a certain type of right wing, like say Elon Musk in Silicon Valley and giant financial organizations that own everything. That die was cast by a 48-year-old Barack Obama who looks extremely young. It's funny that it's not surprising to me that Crowder's first video was commenting on Barry's looks, but he's a young guy deciding the future of the world that we're still living in. And obviously people would point out Obama's role in the 2020 primaries as well. Imagine if he had said, you know what, Bernie has the way. The entire Democratic Party would have lined up behind him, and we would have had some problems maybe with capitalist sabotage of the economy once he took power. But
I'm really looking. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm sorry, getting exciting news. We're going to get our buddy Bronco Marchitich to join us in the post game in a little bit, Matt. So let's talk about this Bernie thing first, and then we're going to go to the post game with Bronco Marchitich, the best, our good friend Ed Jacobin, who's written some really great postmortems on this election, will be joining us. So it's not over yet, but let's get to this Bernie thing because I think I'll tell you. I'm sorry. I hope I don't have to eat my words on this. I found this to be a little bit of a glimpse of excitement here.
I feel like I'm listening to Tame Impala all over again, like it's 2016. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned the working class. I love the frankness of this. God damn,
It's
this
good.
is so
It's
nice. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. First, it was the white working class, and now it is Latino and black workers as well. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change, and they're right. Today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have ever more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the American worker are actually lower than they were 50 years ago. There's a second page here. Let me just make sure that's framed up for you. Oops, that's a long boy. All right, here it is. Today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents. And many of them worry that artificial intelligence, thank you for all that investment, Barack Obama, that you gave to the banks. And many of them worry that artificial intelligence and robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Today, despite spending far more per capita than any other countries, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee health care as a human right, and we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone among major countries cannot even guarantee paid family and medical leave. Today, despite far more per cap. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand pain and the political alienation of tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not. In the coming weeks and months, those of us concerned about grassroots democracy and economic justice need to have some very serious political discussions.
Stay tuned. Let's not forget the
Oh yeah, I missed to stay tuned there. Yeah.
Look, I hope that is exactly the kind of message that needs to be being said. And look, we can have complaints about everyone's strategy. If you want to get on the fucking train right now and say no to this fucking Democratic Party, which has not taken the threat of the reactionary right seriously, you are welcome. And this is a moment right now where we need to be building and growing. And if Bernie wants to fucking light the charge up and get us moving, I'm all about it. I'm hoping that what this is a talk about something serious here, talking about something that's really going to mobilize people. But his language is absolutely right. And look, you can complain and have your strategic differences with certain people who've said, hey, we have to sort of try to work around it in the Democratic Party, right? But if people now are serious saying, we're going to take these people on because they are not serious about addressing our political enemies, which are the Republicans and the leadership of the Democratic Party, we are fucking here for
it. Absolutely.
So we're going to go over the post game. I want to leave people with one quick note of inspiration. If people haven't read my work before on the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, just because this is a dark moment, it could feel a little bleak. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union, if you're unfamiliar, was a movement of workers in the fucking KKK South, working in the vestiges of the slave economy in rural Arkansas, in Tennessee, in Texas, in Bama, and in Mississippi. And they took on the fucking sheriffs who were members of the KKK, the state government, and even the federal government when it wouldn't stand up for them. These were people, many of them illiterate. Many of them were the children of slaves. And they said no. And they organized under the most difficult conditions you could ever imagine. And they stood up and they built and fought for a better world for all of those members and for the working class as a whole. And there's a lot of lessons we can take from our ancestors in a moment like this about working class power, about political independence, and about building strength, solidarity, and community. And I hope that people in this moment where people are rightfully outraged and frustrated do not fall into the trap of despair and do not lock themselves in the false embrace of cynicism, and of falling out of the world and of politics and existence, and really, really take this as a serious moment that we need a fundamental change in this country. And it's going to have to come from everyday people organizing themselves, getting involved in political organizations. We appreciate everyone so much here in the Left Reckoning community who support us over the years. We hope for new folks here, y'all can come and support us and join us over at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. But also join organizations like the DSA. Get involved in all of these important actions on the domestic level and on the international level. If you are in Texas, there's something that I want people to note. There's a link below for a link tree to get involved in this. But in Texas, in Dallas, the JNF Global Conference for Israel is organizing a conference. People who support the genocide and the slaughter in Gaza are organizing a conference in Dallas on November 16th and 17th. And there's ways to get involved to protest this disgusting meeting of people. And for people to get involved, the link tree is in the show notes. Please check that out if you are in the area. We appreciate all the good folks reaching out to us in the shutdown the JNF conference. So please check that out if you are in the area. We appreciate all of y'all so much. We're gonna go over the post game. You get access to that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We're going to be joined by our good friend Branko Marcetic, who I'm very much looking forward to speaking to and hearing his perspective on the election. Matt Leck has this deep dive into Barack Obama's speech, which I've been looking forward to all day. So you're not going to want to miss it, folks. Come over and join us on the other side.